Hello everybody, we're back. We're going to continue on now with the skeletal system physiology from chapter 6, and we're going to talk a little bit more about bone growth and remodeling and how all of this is regulated and controlled within the body. All right, first of all, bone growth is controlled by several different types of hormones that have an influence on it, and some of these won't really surprise you. But growth hormone is a hormone. It's one of the hormones made by the pituitary gland, and you're going to learn a lot more about that when you take Biology 202. But that is a hormone that has an impact on many different tissues in the body. As the name suggests, it promotes growth. And one of the things that it does when you are a child and an adolescent is it ramps up your epiphyseal plate activity. So it's going to stimulate more mitosis of those cartilage cells in there, the chondrocytes, making them divide a little bit quicker so that you keep lengthening the bone. The growth plates are responsible for bone lengthening. And you may have heard before of kids who are not as tall as they're supposed to be. Sometimes those kids are given growth hormone supplements if their parents choose to do so that they'll achieve a more normal height. Second hormone, your thyroid hormones. And again, you're going to learn a lot more about those in Biology 202 as well. The thyroid hormones, as many people already know, you've heard of people talking about how they have trouble with their thyroid and that's influencing their metabolism. And that is true. The thyroid hormones control metabolic rate. How quickly are your cells performing cellular respiration to generate the ATP that they need to power all of the things that they do that require energy? So your thyroid hormones are involved in that. So because of that, your thyroid hormones are able to modulate or control the activity of growth hormone. So growth hormone may be telling the epiphyseal plates to lengthen, and the thyroid hormones, if they get dialed down, that may prevent the influence of growth hormone from being too strong on the growth plates. So basically the thyroid hormones are kind of acting like a dial that either ramps up growth or slows it down depending on what needs to happen at a particular time in the body. All right, and then your sex hormones, testosterone in males, estrogens in females. You have a big burst of those hormones when you reach puberty and your primary sex organs mature, and those hormones also stimulate bone growth. So they're responsible for the growth spurts that adolescents experience, and eventually though, interestingly enough, they stimulate the opposite. They actually signal those epiphyseal plates to close, and once they close, your long bones quit lengthening and you have achieved your maximal height. And as we've talked about before, on average, epiphyseal plate closure occurs earlier in females than it does in males. So those are some hormones that influence your bone growth. Now, while your bones are growing, they also have to be remodeled. And so what do we mean by remodeling? Okay, so your bones can't just keep lengthening and widening all they want, or they would become misshapen, they would become too heavy. The weight of the skeleton is very important. You don't want your skeleton to be way too heavy. That would have a bad influence on many different aspects of bodily function. All right, so what they're showing you over here on the left-hand side in this diagram, this is not the greatest diagram. Well, I guess it's okay, but I think they probably could have done this a little bit more clearly in your textbook. On the left, they're showing you reviewing what happens with bone growth. So you actually have cartilage, the articular cartilage on the ends of the long bones. You have cells in there that are dividing, so it keeps growing. Here in the epiphyses, you have new bone development taking place along in here that's chasing the articular cartilage as the bones get wider and longer. And then down in here, you've got your growth plate or your epiphyseal plate, which is essentially chasing the new bone development in the epiphyses upward and upward and upward and upward. as long as your bones are lengthening. So you have cartilage growing there. And then underneath there, as we talked about in the last video lecture, there's where you had the epiphyseal plate earlier, and those cartilage tissues that were there earlier have now been replaced by bone. So that's bone growth. But your bones need to maintain the particular shape that they need to do the jobs that they're supposed to do. A lot of that is dictated by weight bearing and stresses that are placed on the bone. Your bones, remember at the very beginning of the semester we talked about the form of the body, the anatomy of the body follows the function. So the shape of your bones is really dictated by the weight bearing that they do and the stresses that are placed on them. So your bones have to be remodeled to retain proper shape. Now what they're showing you here, I'm going to erase what I've drawn on there so far, but what they're showing you here, this little red dashed outline, is supposed to represent this over here. So that's what the bone looked like originally. And so over here on the edges, what they're showing you, you got white space there. So you had an area of bone there that developed that needed to be removed. So that's called resorption. The bone was resorbed. Osteoclast cells, those are your bone resorbing cells. They dissolved the bone that was located there, and it's gone because that extra bone there really was not enhancing weight bearing, not protecting against any stresses that the skeletal system was encountering. So you didn't need it, so you wind up getting rid of it. And then another thing they're showing you here down lower in the diaphysis, you have extra bone over here versus what you saw over here on the left. And so you have osteoblasts, those are your bone synthesizing cells, and they have laid down compact bone there on the edges of the diaphyses. Okay, so that's that appositional type growth where the bones are getting wider. And they're also showing you over in here, change pen colors here for a second. So right in here, they're showing you that the medullary cavity, the marrow cavity there, has actually gotten wider. You know, as the long bone, the diaphysis is getting thicker due to appositional growth, the medullary cavity in the center actually gets wider as well. And that helps lighten the bone. Also, you only need as much heavy weight supporting bone as is necessary. And so that occurs through bone resorption as well. So you have osteoclasts that live in here along the endosteum, that little connective tissue membrane you have in there lining the medullary cavity, and they dissolve the excess bone that you no longer need in there as the marrow cavity or the medullary cavity gets wider. So that's showing you the differences between bone growth and bone remodeling, both important processes. A little bit more about bone deposit or bone synthesis. As we've talked about already, the osteoblasts are your bone synthesizing cells, and they're going to do this, of course, while the bones are growing, but then what about later in life after your bones are already fully grown? They're still going to have to be active when bone gets injured or if you needed added strength in a particular location. Okay, so actually if you are someone who exercises a lot, if you run, then the locations where the leg muscles that you use a lot for running, where they pull on your bones to allow your joints to move, the bones are going to thicken at those locations, at those attachment points. And that's why we have a lot of these little bumps and other features on the skeletal system that you're learning about over on the anatomy side. Or if you're a weightlifter, you lift a lot of heavy weights, or for your job, you lift heavy things a lot of times. The muscles that you are using are generating a lot of force and pulling on the bones where they're attached, so you'll actually have thickenings. They'll have more prominent tubercles and tuberosities and those other features that we've learned about where you have thicker areas on the bones. Okay, so proper osteoblasts activity is always going to require a diet rich in protein. And one of the main reasons for that is because the osseous tissue matrix contains collagen, along with other proteins. There are other proteins in that matrix as well. Vitamins C, D, and A are required. Vitamin C is actually required for collagen production. So if you have a diet that is deficient in vitamin C, your collagen will not develop properly, and that can lead to a number of different symptoms. Some of those we'll talk about later, and some of those I'll probably have you guys research on your own as you complete this unit. Vitamin D, just as an example, that's another vitamin that's very important for proper bone synthesis. And many of us already know that you need vitamin D for proper calcium absorption from the diet. And of course, you've got calcium in your bones, so if you want to create new bony tissue, you better be absorbing as much calcium as you can from your diet to support that. Calcium, obviously, you've got to get that from your diet. Phosphorus is something else that you need from your diet. Lesser amounts of magnesium and manganese. Those are mineral ions that you need at lower levels, but they're also important for proper bone synthesis, bone production. All right, then what about this bone resorption or bone remodeling that takes place? The cells that do that again are the osteoclasts. And how do they do this? Let me flip over here for a second. This gives you a little bit better visual on osteoclasts. So these are big giant cells. I really like this picture because they look like little bugs of some type that are sitting there on the surface of the bone. And you see all these little projections they have. They actually use those to dig down into the osseous tissue matrix, into that bone matrix, and they dissolve it, and they're doing that to release the calcium ions. That's usually one of the main reason why they're remodeling or resorbing bone. Another reason, though, would be that you need to get rid of bone that you really don't need anymore, because it's you're trying to make the bones have the proper shape that they need to have for their functions. So let me back up here for a second. How do these osteoclasts do this? So you may remember from Unit 1, one of the organelles you learned about in your cells were the lysosomes. And lysosomes are little membrane-covered packets of digestive enzymes. So osteoclasts will actually secrete those enzymes to the outside of the cell and onto the osseous tissue matrix, onto that bony surface. So those enzymes help break down the organic part of the matrix. So your proteins you have in there, proteoglycans that you have in there, it's going to help break down those larger molecules that are in there. Then the osteoclasts, they also release acids, and the acids help dissolve the hydroxyapatite crystals. Again, those are mainly built from calcium and phosphate and oxygen atoms. And as you break those down, now you've got calcium ions that have been released. You've also got phosphate ions as well. A phosphate, again, is a phosphorus surrounded by 4 oxygen atoms. Those are being released as well. So all this stuff that the osteoclasts have dissolved out of the osseous tissue matrix, those osteoclasts will take those substances inside by endocytosis. That was one of those processes we learned about for membrane transport back in Unit 1. That's where you swallow something up into a membrane-covered vesicle and you take it into the cell. And then they release it over on the other side of the cell by exocytosis. So just to kind of review, you've got a little endocytosis, you've got a little membrane-covered vesicle that pinches off of the surface of the cell, takes in substances from the outside, and then those vesicles will travel over to the other side of the cell and dump out their contents into the surrounding tissue fluids, into those interstitial fluids. So taking it in is endocytosis, spitting it back out is exocytosis. And then you're going to have blood vessels passing through those tissues there, and those substances will wind up, the calcium ions and other things as well, get taken into the bloodstream. Then the blood is going to carry that calcium and other substances throughout the whole body, since the blood vessels are your transportation system. All right, so what do we need? What's going to control remodeling bone? How do we keep this under control? Obviously, you don't want these osteoclasts constantly dissolving your bone matrix. That would not be too good for your skeletal system. But you do need them to do that at times to make sure that your bones have their proper shapes. And it turns out you also need them to be active to help you maintain your calcium levels within proper homeostatic ranges. So just like other things we've talked about with homeostasis, calcium levels in the body fluctuate. You know, when they get too high, the body needs to lower them. When they get too low, the body needs to raise them. And calcium ions are extremely important for the normal function of your body. So as we're going to learn, there are some hormones that control that process, those processes that are involved in calcium homeostasis. And then also mechanical and gravitational forces are involved with controlling remodeling. So the gravitational forces referring to weight bearing. The bones in your body that bear more weight are going to have to be thicker. So you need more bone synthesis in those areas where you have more weight bearing, and you need less osteoclast activity breaking those bones down. Mechanical forces, like what we were talking about, the more you use particular muscles that pull on particular bones, those bones are going to thicken and grow at those locations. All right, so I'll actually stop that video lecture there, and we're going to get into some more information about regulating bone growth and remodeling in part 2, and we're especially going to focus on how the human body maintains calcium ion homeostasis, extremely important topic.